Okay, so this is History 362, Lecture 10. And just to avoid confusion, there is no Lecture 8 or 9. Those are dedicated to other activities within the context of the class, but I am numbering class meetings sequentially, so this becomes Lecture 10. Today I'm going to be talking about two issues, the Great Migration and the Great War. Now, the Great Migration was one of the largest movements of people in U.S. history, and it was the migration of African Americans leaving the Jim Crow South between 1910 and about 1940, although some people number the Great Migration as having ended in the 1970s. In 1910, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. By 1940, 77% of African Americans lived in the South. So approximately 1.5 million African Americans moved north, mostly to cities, between 1915 and 1940. Many black migrants left southern cities, but some also left plantations and farms to settle in urban areas. They abandoned sharecropping and tenant farming for urban wage work. Why did black migrants leave the South? Well, there were all kinds of what historians call push factors, including poverty, debt peonage, lynching, stagnant wages, and the daily violence and indignities of Jim Crow. There were natural disasters that pushed some migrants out of rural communities. For example, there were boll weevils. The boll weevil is a cotton-eating beetle that spread from Mexico to Texas in the 1890s and then throughout the South and really devastated cotton crops. And as you'll recall, most sharecroppers in the post-Civil War period were growing cotton. And there were floods in the Mississippi Valley during the winter of 1916 and in North Carolina in 1917, and these damaged farms and pushed people out. Finally, economic depression also drove black migrants out of the South. Cotton markets declined following the outbreak of World War I in Europe, and this had a significant impact on black farmers. Here is a very nice picture of a family that is migrating from the South to the North, dressed, I think, in some of their best clothes, posing for the camera. Okay, so what were the pull factors that brought people to the North? Well, there were new labor opportunities. Job opportunities in war industries expanded just as the immigrant labor pool was disappearing. More than 1 million European immigrants came to the U.S. in 1914, but in 1915, the outbreak of war in Europe resulted in the number of European immigrants dropping to 200,000. Northern industries were desperate for labor, so they dispatched agents to recruit black workers from the North. You could be paid up to $5 a day in a northern factory, and this was in contrast to 75 cents a day at the jobs that they had previously had in the South. So new labor opportunities that paid better were part of it. There was also chain migration, and chain migration just means the first people migrate to a certain area, and then those are followed by their family members and friends and neighbors. Black Southerners who moved north sent home letters describing high-paying jobs, good schools for their children, opportunities for political involvement. And when they went back home to visit their families in the South, they often had city clothes, new cars, and an abundance of money that showed that, there were better opportunities for African Americans in the North. Railroads aided African Americans by offering special group rates. African Americans from Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas traveled East Coast railroads to Philadelphia, Newark, New York, and Buffalo. Black Southerners from Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee took the Illinois Central line to St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. And these tangible railroad networks were aided by information networks. African Americans worked on railroads as sleeping car porters. I will be talking more about the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in a subsequent lecture. But they were the sleeping car porters, they were the maids, and so they provided African Americans in the South with valuable information about Northern life. They also distributed copies of a famous newspaper called the Chicago Defender that promoted Southern migration. Now, I told you that 1.5 million African Americans went to the North in this time period. About 6 million Black people remained in the South. Not until the 1960s did a majority of African Americans live outside the South. Why did some stay? Well, some believed that the South was their historic and natural home, and they said, better the place that we know than the place that we don't know. It was also the case that Black business people and professionals in the South, those who were in southern cities, didn't want to lose their customers. So they discouraged Black migrants by saying there are things about the North that you're not going to like. There's a hostile social environment. It's cold up there. There is racial exclusion in the labor unions. You could be unemployed. Urban communities are overcrowded. Rents are expensive. And there are race riots. So these were all the arguments that were made against migration. Now this is a nice picture here showing you the states of origin and the kinds of directions that people went in as they migrated during the Great Migration up along the East Coast from Florida into the sort of central Midwest, from Mississippi and Alabama, from Louisiana and Texas up to Minneapolis and into St. Louis, and a lot of Texans even going all the way out to California to the cities of Los Angeles and Oakland. All right, so as I said a moment ago, the Chicago Defender played a unique role during the Great Migration because the newspaper maintained a large circulation in the South. Black Southerners constituted approximately 2/3 of the Defender's readership, and the Defender's readers shared articles published in the paper about Northern migration. The mouthpiece of 14 million people, said the masthead of the Chicago Defender. It was founded by Robert Abbott in 1905, and he used the paper to take a militant stance on issues of the day, in addition to listing jobs and train schedules. "Ride for a day and a night to freedom," he said. "You tip your hat to no white man. You are a man and are expected to carry yourself as such." Approximately 50,000 Southern African Americans headed for Chicago, home of the Defender, between 1916 and 1920. Many African Americans saw the South as a kind of promised land, sort of taking a page from slavery times in which the North represented a kind of freedom, and Exodus was the book of the Bible that people looked to talk about, this is where you go if you want freedom. People really looked to the North as a kind of promised land. Once they arrived in the North, Black Southern migrants rebuilt their households, they developed new work routines, they settled their children in schools, made new friends, and became part of new neighborhoods, especially establishing new church homes. Northern Black churches and benevolent societies helped Black Southern migrants. In Chicago, the Phyllis Wheatley Home gave young women a safe place to live while they looked for work. Elizabeth Lindsay Davis, a teacher and a Black clubwoman, she was involved in women's clubs for African Americans. She founded the Phyllis Wheatley Home in 1908. It was a settlement house similar to that which Jane Addams had founded in Chicago in the 19th century. The Phyllis Wheatley home provided Southern migrants with jobs and housing, and club women who were middle-class women came to the Phyllis Wheatley home to volunteer to show migrants how to get along in a city environment. Long-established Chicago churches, like the Quinn Chapel AME Church, which was the oldest black church, reached out to Southern migrants to join their congregations. The Olivet Baptist Church congregation grew rapidly during the migration because its members met new arrivals at railroad stations and helped them get settled in new homes. The church provided employment and home location services, women's groups to aid homemakers and single women, a club for boys and girls, a nursery and kindergarten for working mothers, a workingman's home, and a food pantry with a dining room. And I should say that many immigrant communities for European immigrants had these same kinds of churches or synagogues that also acted as social service organizations. So in this, the African American community was really following in the model of existing churches and synagogues in the North. Now, while Chicago's black Christian congregations grew in the wake of the migration, there was tension between middle-class black Chicagoans and the working-class black Southern migrants. Newcomers often said the church services in Chicago didn't have the same kind of emotions. They didn't have the kind of sermon styles that they were accustomed to. And it wasn't just a matter of differences in worship styles. It was also a matter of people's backgrounds. Black Chicagoans were suspicious of new Pentecostal churches that took root in northern cities. The Pentecostal churches are kind of the same thing as what's called the Holiness Movement. The Holiness Movement was a breakaway movement within the Methodist Church in which congregants sought a personal, life-changing experience of grace, and it could be kind of a full-body experience. Pentecostal preachers encouraged congregants to speak in tongues. Migrants from Tennessee and Mississippi had founded 20 storefront churches in Chicago by 1919. Another source of tension between newcomers and Chicago natives was labor unions. Black Southern migrants were uneasy about joining unions, particularly because white trade unions would not accept them. When the Stockyards Labor Council attempted to organize butchering and meatpacking workers in an interracial union, only Chicago natives joined. Southern newcomers shied away from membership. And in fact, there was kind of a race riot in 1919 as white workers attacked black workers for strike breaking in the meatpacking industry. So the Southern migrants were not wrong that joining a labor union could be dangerous. There were housing tensions between African Americans and whites as a result of the migration. Residential segregation restricted black people to quote-unquote black neighborhoods, but soon the number of black migrants exceeded the housing available in such neighborhoods. So looking at Chicago as an example, between 1910 and 1920, the population on the south side, which was considered to be the black neighborhood near the stockyards, tripled. The community couldn't keep up in terms of the sewage. There were lighting issues. There was insufficient police protection. Because housing was scarce, rent was super expensive. Rent in the South Side neighborhoods was more expensive than rents in white neighborhoods, and groceries were also more expensive. But African Americans were not permitted to move beyond the so-called Black Belt. White homeowners associations barred African Americans from moving to their communities, and they used legal obstacles and violence to keep them out. Segregation in the North was not based on Jim Crow laws per se. The law, when there is a legal segregation, that's called de jure, or segregation by law. But segregation can also just be by custom, which is called de facto segregation. Northern black communities were distinct and separate from white neighborhoods, and even though this wasn't, codified in the law, there were, you were taking a risk if you tried to be somewhere where customs said you shouldn't be. As was the case in the South, Black districts were lively and self-sufficient, with Black businesses, churches, social clubs, and organizations. And some of the main organizations or main places where people used to go to hang out included funeral parlors. Black funeral directors were very respected in Northern communities. They allowed meetings to be held at their funeral homes. Funeral parlor owners were often involved in politics. And beauty parlors and barber shops were another place where African Americans met and could talk freely without white people listening in. In the North, African Americans voted and engaged in politics because Black voting was not legally obstructed. As a result, Black neighborhoods created voting blocks that put African Americans in public office. On the south side of Chicago, African Americans elected Oscar DePriest, a Republican, as an alderman for the 2nd Ward in 1915 and sent him to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1928. He was the first African American to serve in Congress since 1901. Black women in Chicago also participated in the political system. For example, Fannie Barrier Williams was the first Black woman to serve on Chicago's library board. Why were beauty parlors such a node for Black women socializing? Well, Black women in northern cities had access to hair straightening processes and products that allowed them to adopt new styles as a symbol of their new urban identity, but this also meant that they had to spend a lot of time at the beauty parlor. Black beauty parlors provided jobs. They provided an avenue for activism among Black women in Chicago. And there was a line of beauty products called Madam C.J. Walker's Hair Products. And according to Maggie Wilson, who was a Chicago sales agent for these hair products, these kinds of jobs offered Black women in the beauty industry an opportunity to not be domestic servants in other people's homes. There was a union of women hairdressers called the Hair Culturists Union of America, and these Black women who were involved in that union did community work and activism. All right, so this gives you some sense of what the situation was in the early 20th century in urban areas, that many African Americans had moved to the North, and it's just at this moment when World War I broke out. I'm not going to talk about the origins of World War I here, but suffice it to say that in April 1917, America entered World War I on the side of France and Great Britain against the Central Powers, which included Germany and Austria-Hungary. It really took about a year for American troops to get mobilized to be over there, but they officially joined the fray in April 1917. African Americans had a mixed response to the war. Most African Americans embraced their patriotic duty and enlisted in the armed forces. Others bought war bonds or contributed to the Red Cross, but some objected to participating in the war effort. Interestingly, W.E.B. Du Bois instructed African Americans to, quote, forget our special grievances and close our ranks, shoulder to shoulder with our white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy. So you might have expected Du Bois to oppose the war, but he didn't. However, Chandler Owen and A. Philip Randolph will later be the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. They insisted the war was nothing but an effort to advance capitalist interests, and so Black working people didn't have any reason to fight. At the start of the war, African Americans were 10% of the nation's population, but they made up 13% of the draftees. More than 2.3 million Black men registered for the draft. 380,000 actually served, but only 3% of the combat forces That is, 42,000 black men saw combat in World War I battles. Most black soldiers were relegated to support units, doing things like loading and unloading supplies, digging trenches, and burying the dead. Army units were segregated, and the Navy and Coast Guard only allowed African Americans to serve in menial positions. The Marines and nursing units prohibited black servicemen and servicewomen altogether. So you see on top a black infantry regiment, and on the bottom here are some mess attendants working in World War I. They would have worked in the kitchen. The United States maintained 4 long-standing black regiments, but these regiments were not assigned overseas combat duties. The NAACP and the Chicago Defender pressured the Army to include black servicemen in the war effort. And the U.S. military responded to black pressure by training 2 combat divisions with black officers at a segregated camp in Des Moines, Iowa. 1,000 black men received commissions, but only a few commanded troops, and those who did served in lower ranks and led only black troops. The combat training that these troops got was inferior. They were often trained with picks and shovels instead of guns, and their training camps didn't have bathroom facilities or blankets in the winter. Those soldiers who did travel to Europe to fight traveled in the holds of poorly ventilated, segregated ships, and were segregated once they actually got to Europe as well. Despite the segregation and discrimination that black soldiers faced in the Army, they performed exceptionally well when sent into combat. The 369th Infantry Regiment, nicknamed the Hellfighters, from Harlem's 15th New York National Guard, served for a record 191 days at the front alongside the French, who outfitted, armed, and fed them. The entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, which is the French military's highest honor. While the French acknowledged the Harlem Infantry Regiment's work, the United States didn't give any medals to black soldiers in World War I until Corporal Freddie Stowers of Company C of the 371st Regiment got the Congressional Medal of Honor after his death. French citizens appreciated black soldiers' valor in battle, but they were also drawn to black culture. Encounters with black soldiers introduced French citizens to jazz and ragtime. James Reese Europe, a New York band leader who played the music of black composers, directed the 369th Regimental Band, which you saw on the previous slide. While the band was not permitted to march in New York City's Victory Parade, they held a separate parade on Fifth Avenue led by James Reese Europe and drum major Bill Bojangles Robinson on February 17, 1919. Fifth Avenue had other all-black parades. On July 28, 1917, the NAACP and New York religious leaders held a protest in solidarity against an East St. Louis race riot. Protest banners read, "Mr. President, why not make America safe for democracy?" Because the motto of World War I was that it was a war to make the world safe for democracy. In the spring and summer of 1917, East St. Louis erupted in racial violence. Violence broke out after the Aluminum Ore Company hired 470 black workers to replace striking white workers who belonged to the American Federation of Labor Local. Whites fired guns into the segregated black district. 2 white plainclothes policemen were killed, and white mobs could not be contained. By the time authorities restored order, nearly $400,000 worth of property damage had been done, leaving hundreds of black families homeless. Anti-black violence that occurred nationwide throughout the summer of 1919 caused the field secretary for the NAACP to call it the Red Summer. White backlash flared in response to the increasing number of black Southern migrants who had moved to northern cities, occupied industry jobs, and took up residence in northern neighborhoods. And there was even a riot in Houston. 13 black soldiers were tried for mutiny, convicted, and hanged. So here is the 1917 all-black parade that I was telling you about in response to the East St. Louis violence. Lynchings rose from 36 in 1917 to 60 in 1918 and 76 in 1919. 10 of the men lynched during these years were black veterans in uniform. Black Sergeant Major Joe Green was shot and killed by a white streetcar conductor in Birmingham, Alabama, when he was asked for change. Private Wilbur Little was murdered by whites while in uniform in Blakely, Georgia. His attackers said that he should wear civilian clothes, but Little didn't own any other clothes, and as a result, he was shot and killed. Black veterans grew impatient with discrimination and white hostility. They expected that, you go fight for your country, that you ought to come back and receive respect and perhaps desegregation. W.E.B. Du Bois demanded action to combat racism and discrimination after the war, but people had a really hard time fighting back against discrimination due to the first Red Scare that erupted right after World War I. The government got very paranoid about communists and socialists and anarchists, and there were great roundups of European migrants, and people were accused of all kinds of radical beliefs, and they were deported. So in the midst of this, it was hard even for African Americans who were clearly not, Bolsheviks or anarchists, to assert their rights, especially their rights in connection with labor. The Red Scare ended up causing this sort of 100% Americanism backlash, and it made it very difficult for any kind of minorities or people of color. All right, that's it. See you in the comments.